Good morning, everyone. Welcome to session 2 for Sabbath, much more than worship. Let's look at what we learned last week before we get started this week, just for a reminder for everyone. So last week we learned that Sabbath was something God valued for God's own self. God wanted to finish things and rest. That Sabbath rest is something that God valued in there we go. Let me make sure that God valued it for God's own character. Then the idea, we have a lot of people. See waiting room. Admit. All right.
Got more coming.
Oop. There we go. Where was I? All right. So resting for God. So when it switched from the idea of it became God's own character, it became something.
Yeah, I can't.
No audio.
No audio.
There we go. So, oh, sorry.
Your audio is working.
Unmuted by host.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Harry. There you go. Sorry, friend. Oh, you won't let me mute you. We're just gonna keep rolling right through it, like a stop sign, I guess. All right. We, in a way, God's character of resting became God's admiring God's own creation. So the creation was good and made and completed and suited for its purpose, as you guys have heard me said. God resting was, in a way, was a God's admiring work of what he had done for the last 6 days. But then when the fall happened and we had the story of Adam and Eve and the apple, the condemnation of the giving of sin became this idea of the lack of Sabbath. There, now I'm working for them. Sorry, friends. And so we, because of the fallen world, became bound to sin, and that lack of Sabbath or bondage to work was the act of falling, or the understanding of being in sin was the bondage to work, and that meant death for us. That the bondage to sin meant death. So, and today we learn about trying to create a civilized society. Moses tried to integrate God's character with the character of the community. Sabbath became evidence of, or the proof that they just didn't have or did have trust in God. And Sabbath became a mark of what it meant to be a Jew, an outwardly sign of faithfulness of the people. And then we learned that while they were in the wilderness, Sabbath was installed for the people on Sunday, that that God would provide enough food the day before, that they would collect it and put it in bushels, and it would not rot. So they were able to not work, and they didn't have to go outside their homes on the Sabbath day of Saturday. So what happened next after this comes into the Deuteronomical and Levitical laws about Sabbath. Once the Jewish people became the dominant culture and became the dominant, became the landowners, became servant owners, became the dominant culture within the Promised Land, the Sabbath became one of the most ordering factors of the Jewish society. And so today we're going to go through the Deuteronomical and Levitical law to try to figure out what was the next step of this kind of evolution of Sabbath. And you will see that it shifts from God's character into a gift to the people for rest, and into a distinct law that had lots of statutes and lots of implications if you broke the law. So let's walk our way through this Levitical, Deuteronomical expression of things. So at the end of Genesis, while they're preparing to go into the Promised Land, they tell about, Moses is supposed to tell the people about Sabbath. So remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. For 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But on the seventh day is a Sabbath to your Lord. You shall not do any work, And you will see that mantra throughout the Levitical law, that they will say that first part over and over and over again. But the part that changes is always what comes after. So, you shall not do any work. And then it says, you, your son, or your daughter, or your male or female slaves, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. So that's a big change, right? This has changed from an idea that it's a personal piety, that God is to trust in God personally, to not go out in the field and grab the quail and the honey, that you don't have to go out and harvest on Friday. It changed from a personal piety exercise to how do you rule as a people? How does this Sabbath affect a community? And so at the end is when Moses is trying to teach them how to be a community together and how to own land and be a dominant culture. It says Sabbath is not just for you. Sabbath is just not for you. It's for all your dependents. And so they say you, your son, daughter, blah, blah, and the alien resident in your town. Just the idea of saying that there is an alien resident in your town, that there is someone that is not a part of your community that is living there, is automatically showing that you are the dominant culture, that you have the expression, you have the power over the alien. And often the alien is a sense of when they went into the Holy Land, they had to overcome a culture. It was a war, right? They had to go in and thwart the people that were already in and put them as a slave in their culture. So at the end of our Exodus experiences, Moses is trying to communicate them. This is the first labor law. This is like the first labor law of an interesting union between God and each other. It's this idea that that the Israelites have to specifically live in a certain type of way when it comes to being a community. Okay, it's also an interesting promise of sorts, right? That we have no idea what the faith tradition or the cultural heritage of the alien resident or the slave or the female slave, that this Israelite law or this Israelite gift that is meant about trust and relationship between God and humanity, the gifts of that law is supposed to be for all things, right? So this is the Abrahamic understanding of blessing to be a blessing. Right, so that this is not just for Israelites people; it's for all people underneath Israelite law and under Israelite things. So this Sabbath understanding is meant for everything, and it's even powerful that it says your livestock. Right, we don't quite understand. Like originally, it was about an interpersonal relationship between God and humanity. Don't work on this day. But now it's literally a gift for creation. There doesn't seem to be much that a livestock can do to respond to God's gift here, right? So it is for all creation, and this is like the first maturation of the Sabbath. That is not just for an interpersonal relationship between me and God, but that is a cultural move. And so after that, they usually go back into the mantra for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and the sea and all that is in them, but they rested on the seventh day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. And you will see through each one of these passages that the first two parts are usually the same or reiterations of the thing, but in the middle they usually expand on it. All right. You yourself are the speaker to the Israelites. You shall keep the Sabbath as a sign in between you and me and you throughout your generations. Give it in order that you may know that I am the Lord your God, sanctify you. Observing the Sabbath throughout their generationals. So here we have an understanding. Oh, we lost. I'm gonna try people. We're losing people, huh? They're coming back in. All right, she's trying again. All right, so very similar kind of language, but now we have generational gift, that this is something that you move into a community, you take the promised land, and once you get into the promised land, you not only get practice of doing this as a community, but you need to pass it down. This is something to be passed down. This is something that is to be continued on from generation to generation. And so because it's something to be passed on, there has to be some kind of consequence. So anyone who profanes it shall be put to death. Whoever does any work on it shall be cut off from among the people. For 6 days you shall work be done, but the seventh is a Sabbath solemn to the Holy Lord. Whoever does any work on a Sabbath day shall be put to death. Therefore, the Israelites shall keep the Sabbath, observing Sabbath throughout their generation for a perpetual covenant. So look at the maturation here. First, it's God's character. Second, it's a way to rest on the seventh day while in the wilderness, that you don't have to do anything in interpersonal trust. Do you trust God? No, you walked out there and tried to gather anyways. Yeah, we failed at that. We're going to create it as a society norm of everything that we were supposed to do for all living creatures in our society, that they should have a breakdown. And the next step is to create consequences, and while trying to create a generational exercise of this. And now this experience of Sabbath is not just to a object lesson between God and humanity. It is now a perpetual covenant. It's supposed to be forever. This is a forever experience. And so whenever you make something forever, then things get weird. Then it becomes, so how are we going to defend this? What is the law? How far will the law have to go? What happens when people break it? What will it look like? How do we mark time? What if, some days, the more civilized a society get, the more you'll need people to work on the day on the day of Sabbath, and all of a sudden everything gets out of hand. But now we have this idea of Sabbath is a perpetual covenant. So this is supposed to be passed on. Sabbath is meant to be timeless and sustained. So it's timeless that it put a capital punishment for those who break in it. Why? Why would we want to do this? Why would they want to create Sabbath and a capital punishment? Well, let's think about this. If we experience this law as a way to confine us and not liberate us, if we were a landowner or a business owner or someone who has power and a position, this isn't exactly good news to us. This is one more thing that we have to worry about. This is one more thing that we have to be concerned about. And this Sabbath, this capital punishment is for those that will reap the harvest, that are most at risk of everything. But what if this is gospel? How can this be gospel? How can this be good news? Well, what if you're someone who's forced to work? What if you're a slave? What if you're an indentured servant? What if you were someone that was forced to work? And so the people who are trying to make you work on the Sabbath day could be still held accountable to this Sabbath break. If they are trying to force you to work on the Sabbath day, they can still be held accountable. So this idea that if you break this, it's a capital punishment is actually trying to, in the order, protect the workers. Trying to protect the workers, and to give them actually a day off. And think about this in the long run. This is still a community in which the Ten Commandments still say, you shall not murder. Like this is saying how how blasphemy this breaking of Sabbath is for the original Israelite people, is to put death as the outcome, or the or the consequence of everything. So then, because as soon as you make something a rule and as soon as you make it perpetual, there's going to be all kinds of loopholes and there's going to be all kinds of exception to rules and everything gets messy. All right. So again, for 6 days you shall work be done, but on the seventh day on Sabbath, complete rest. Like they expanded even more. It's not just rest anymore. It's complete rest. A holy convocation, you shall do no work. It is Sabbath to the Lord throughout your settlements. So we have this idea that it's not just, your livestock, your slaves, your things, but now you're so powerful that you have settlements. You are now in control of other societies, other things. And so now you have settlements. And so now we will have all kinds of interesting appointed festivals that are around the Sabbath. Not just the Sabbath, but the Sabbath is now going to order everything else. So these are the appointed festival of the Lord, the holy convocations, which shall celebrate at the time appointed to them. In the first month of the 14th day of the month at twilight, there shall be a Passover offering to the Lord. And on the 15th day of the same month is the festival unleavened bread to the Lord. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. And on the first day you shall have holy convocation. You shall not work at your occupations. You shall not work at your occupations. For 7 days you shall present your Lord's offering by fire, and on the seventh day you shall be of a holy convocation, and you shall not have to work your convocation. So now, by this point, in Leviticus 23, we have now assimilated Sabbath into worship. Worship and Sabbath have now become together. It wasn't before this, but now there is sacrifice and honoring and all kinds of other litigations that go along with these convocations, which is this act of worship or an act of dedication. Usually have to do with the temple or the synagogue, whoever is closest and what you had. So now Sabbath is now associated with worship. Before this, Sabbath was never associated with worship. It was a civic law of order and how you treat each other. Now in Leviticus 23, it becomes an act of worship and a highly pageantry one on the 15th day of the festival and associated with the Passover feast, which sounds like communion, right? This is the first communion when it comes to worship. And in there, you're not supposed to perform your occupations, which is a bit different than work, isn't it? Now you're not performing your occupation, right? Before you were a farmer, and that farmer really wasn't an occupation. It was probably more like a vocation, right? When you have occupations, you have another order of society, right? You are more sophisticated if you have occupations other than you picking up rocks. You have this. You have blacksmiths now. You have doctors, right? This is a whole different level of civilized society if you have occupations. So before is like, oh, you're not supposed to work. Now is, oh, don't do your job, right? That's different, right? There's a difference here, which is, I think it's hard. Like, oh, it's Sabbath. I don't have to clean the house. Well, is clean the house your job? No, I'm a pastor. Then clean the house, right? There seems to be some form of argument going on here where we have to do something. Like, what is work looking like? And we see this in some of the issues with Hasidic Judaism and Reform Judaism, and they've tried to put what is level of work looks like, right? And so by Leviticus 23, it seems to be more about your occupation than work. So, and I think Jesus starts to mess with this. I think this is how Jesus starts to mess with sabbatical law when we get to that in a couple of weeks. Because I don't think Jesus sees any of his healing as a job. So he goes into this experience of, but then everybody else says, oh, you're doing a job here. You're healing people. You're a healer. So here we have, you shall not work your occupations. And Sabbath is now being deeply associated with the act of worship. And then from the day after Sabbath. Now, this is really interesting. It comes on in the rest of 23. Now, the day after Sabbath. And now we start to realize that Sabbath is marking everything. It's like days since sobriety, or days since I last drank, or days since this. Like, it's you mark society with Sabbath if you say like the days after Sabbath. I'm not going to read the whole part of this. It's about this interesting sheaves and 2 loaves and breads and offering it, who offers it, when. Everything gets wonderfully complicated. But down to 21 here. On that same day, you shall make proclamation. You shall hold a holy convocation, which is kind of like worship. You shall not work your occupation. This is the statute forever in all your settlements throughout all your generations. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and for the alien. I am the Lord your God. So Sabbath, again, going into the civic law, this would mean that the poor and the needy and the alien are able to work on the Sabbath to go glean the field, right? So they're just parsing out different ways of the Sabbath happening. That the Sabbath is for the most marginalized, right? The Sabbath, the people who are supposed to be breaking here are the people who have the resources, that have the power over the field. The people those who are in the marginalized sense should go glean the field at this time, go into the field and get that opportunity. And in here we have the first instances. We're going to have another instances in which Sabbath is for creation, is for giving creation a break and letting people harvest differently there. So Sabbath marks times and orders your work. And so not everybody Sabbaths at the same time at this moment during this kind of experience. I'm going to take a break here. I think I've been talking too long. Is there any questions so far?
Well, Pastor, I have a question about verse 22.
Yeah.
Is there something later on that indicates that this is to happen on the Sabbath? I was always under the impression that the gleaning sort of happened along with the harvesting all week long.
That's a great question. I
don't know why those two are.
When we have the next text, or one of the next texts, that talks about the sabbatical year that all land should have.
Yeah.
And that was talking about in which all land should have a break. And so if it may not be on the Sabbath, it's part of the Sabbath principles to glean.
Mm-hmm.
So if they're not going out there on the Sabbath to get the gleaning, it's part of the Sabbath principles that gleaning should happen. It's part of the ordering of the world.
Okay, thank you.
I
have a question.
Yeah.
I guess I find all this extra little details disappointing. Like last week, it was so cool to think like, and this is the rule, this is how it's going to be. It was easy for me to understand, wrap my mind around, like, okay, a day of rest, a day of coming together back with God, a day of being. And now there's all this, like, there's all the exceptions. I find that disappointing. Why would God do that?
That's a really interesting question. And I think I don't know how much that's a wonderful question. How much of this is a God thing?
Yeah.
And I think for me, one of the things that I go, wow, how much of this is a God thing, when you put consequences like death as a consequence for breaking it, that sounds a little bit more like us than God.
Well, I can understand that though, actually, because like it's not exactly, but the principle is the same as right now, where we have shelter in place, rule, and also you're supposed to wear a mask in a store, but some people aren't doing it. So you kind of feel like, what's the point of it? If one person is not doing it, it makes other people feel like, well, then I don't have to do it either, right? You know what I mean? It's like, and in this case where businesses could keep running, you would feel like, ooh, that guy's doing it, I better do it too. If I don't, if I stay with the Sabbath like I'm supposed to, but they're not following the rule, I'm going to get behind in business or in this, why do I have to do it if everybody else is doing their own thing? I can see that reason for sure, because it enforces it. Like, you better do it. Everyone's doing it. Do it.
Yeah, it's an extreme consequence, but it is trying to communicate an importance, right? It is trying to communicate a distinct importance, and we can all get behind the understanding of importance when it comes to the marginalized. That if this rule is meant to protect the marginalized, and then putting such an extreme understanding of that rule for the marginalized, then we can understand the gospel in this for the sake of those who are marginalized, in the context that this is good news. The consequences are then good news for the marginalized. Like, for example, when, recently when we've expanded crimes where it's not just a crime if it's a hate crime, right? Because if it becomes a hate crime, there's more extreme measures and more extreme consequences if it's a hate crime. Instead of, you can kill someone, but if you kill someone out of obvious hate crime, then it's even worse. Then there's even something worse consequences. So in that situation, I think I think that it's good, but it is also heavy-handed. It is also interestingly heavy-handed, and it begs the question to me. You don't make rules in a vacuum. So I would love to have been some form of person on the side, on the fly in the wall of these decision makings for these people to say, okay, who was breaking Sabbath, and why were they breaking Sabbath, and why did they need these rules? Because if no one was really breaking Sabbath, we really wouldn't need these rules. So someone was breaking Sabbath, and so who did they want to kill? Like, who did they feel like, who wasn't listening so bad that they had to go this far to do this? Who was it? Well, it was probably people who thought they were above the law, whoever that might be, or whatever that position they were in. It was someone that felt like they could live above the law, and that somehow the laws didn't matter to them, or they did not believe the law applied to them. It reminds me of a conversation that I had where I talk with someone. It's like, yeah, I give money to the police union so I can get out of all my tickets, so I can have this sticker on the back of my car to say that I gave to the police union, so that when I get pulled over, the law doesn't apply to me. Mm-hmm. And so this understanding that, you can live outside the law. And I think that must have been the case. There were people that thought that the Sabbath didn't mind. And my guess is they were wealthy landowners because they were the one losing money and precious productivity with all these sabbatical laws. But I wasn't there for that.
The other thing in these verses that to me reeks of human instead of God is the gleaning, is that you leave the outside of your field to give away. Well, the outside of your field produces less than the inside of your field. So you keep the good stuff for yourself and you give the marginal away. And you think if it was God doing that, he'd probably leave the middle of the field to give away.
I just assumed that was always because they didn't want them really on their property. You can come to the border and get
Ah,
what you can get
true.
just over the fence, but I don't want you all over the rest of the field.
People again.
Yeah, and then in contrast to that is the act of tithing. If tithing is something we should benefit, if tithing is part of a faith response, you tithe first. You give your first fruits, your first harvest to the Lord. So it's an interesting dichotomy of both value of tithing, that you should give your first fruit, but guess the first fruits go to the church. So I guess the poor rate a little bit behind that, if that's part of it. So that's an interesting understanding of everything there. Any other thoughts so far? All right, we'll get back into the slides here. So, as forementioned, the Day of Atonement. So this is right before it talks about the sabbatical year for the land. But the Lord spoke to Moses, "Now on the 10th day of the 7th month, in the day of the atonement, it shall be a holy convocation or worship. For you shall deny yourselves." You shall deny yourself. So this is the first language in which Sabbath is also an act of denying yourself. You shall deny yourself the presence of the Lord's offering and by fire, and you shall not work during the entire day, for it is a day of atonement, to make atonement on your behalf before God and before the Lord your God. For anyone who does not practice the self-denial during the entire day shall be cut off from the people. And anyone who does any work during the entire day, such as one I will destroy in the midst of the people. You shall not do work. It is a statute forever throughout the generations and all your settlements. It shall be to you a Sabbath, a complete rest, and you shall deny yourself on the 9th day of the month at evening. From evening to evening you shall keep your Sabbath. Wow, it just keeps on getting tougher. You're not only not supposed to work, right? But now you're supposed to deny yourself to affect the atonement, to understand the Sabbath is not only just a way to connect with God, but the way to atone with God, to make things right with God. And so as this understands here, this is even making more expectations on Sabbath, more expectations on what it's supposed to look like. It's not only that you don't work, but you're supposed to then deny yourselves. And so this is a new entrance of this holiday of complete rest, this experience of keeping Sabbath as a self-denial. And I think that's we talk about in Lent, where you're supposed to give up stuff for Lent, and I've never quite thought of worship being a self-denial aspect, or deny ourselves stuff. But that's the extension of this Levitical law for this complete holiday rest. So now the sabbatical year. When you enter the land that I am giving you, the land shall observe a Sabbath for the Lord. For 6 years you shall sow your field, and for 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather it in its field. But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of complete rest for the land, a Sabbath for the Lord. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard. You shall not reap the aftergrowth of your harvest, or gather the grapes of your unpruned vine. It shall be a year of complete rest for the land. You may eat what the land yields during its Sabbath. You and your male and your female slaves, your hired hand and bound laborers who live with you, for your livestock also, and for the wild animals in your land, all its yields shall be for food. this passage seems to be speaking out of both sides of its mouth to me. One, the whole thing should be complete Sabbath, but just don't harvest the unprudency. You can harvest the rest. You're going to be able to eat. You're going to be able to eat stuff, and you can take stuff to eat, and your male, female slaves, and all your bond laborers, you can eat, but you're not supposed to eat it all. It's an interesting trying to play both sides of this coin, where the passage really wants to truly set the land and have complete Sabbath for it. But yet there's still a need for people to eat and to use the land and to get the land. Now, farmers kind of understand this, right? So you can only plant corn for so long, right? You have to switch it. Right now, it seems to be most people switch between corn and soybeans, back and forth. Because corn sucks the nutrients so much out of the land that it can literally like suck it dry of almost every nutrient that's possibly there. And so some pattern, I don't remember the pattern, but you go from corn to soybean over and over again. I don't know if it's on a 5-6 year pattern, but there's some kind of set. And the soybean gives back to the land better than the corn does. So the soybean creates a different type of soil. And at some point, usually they try to give it some form of rest. This is why sometimes when you're driving through towns and you see a soybean field and there's one stalk of corn in the middle of it, and like they're completely out of place because there's somehow the corn was left in the field, but then it's surrounded by soybean. And so the farmers understand the need for sabbatical life in their field.
No, they just don't.
Part of the harsh things right now is we can so artificially feed our fields that some people aren't able to, and some farmers aren't able to take these different exercises of switching their fields and giving it a break. And so we've technologically no longer need this, but it's still there, and it's still probably a good thing for the sake of the livestock and the people as well, the laborers. And so the creation needs a Sabbath. There's an interesting feel to creation having a Sabbath right now, as more wild animals are taking over civic places, and the environment is breathing a bit more fresh with a bit less, carbon dioxide in the air due to all the travel down. There's something kind of sabbatical happening in the creation right now. And it's supposed to be like a season, a year, a sabbatical year. I was a part of a congregation that took a sabbatical year for almost every one of its ministries. They disbanded almost everything. I think some of you guys have told you this already, but they disbanded most of their programmatic ministries, went to basic Bible studies and worship for everyone. And then after that year of sabbatical, they said, okay, what do we miss the most and why? What kind of harvest do? And they refocused their budgets and refocused everything into what matters most, or what they feel they missed the most, so they can know what's most important. I think that's a powerful thing. I think there's something very powerful in that form of sabbatical exercise, and almost mimics this idea of giving creation a break here in the sabbatical year. Sabbath is then expanded into the year of Jubilee. And so you shall count off 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the period of 7 weeks of years gives 49 years. Then you shall have a trumpet sounded loud. And on the 10th day of the 7th month, on that day of atonement, you shall have the trumpet sounded throughout all of the land. And you shall hallow the 15th year, and you shall proclaim liberty. You shall proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. And liberty is really important here. This means because there are indentured servants, there is debt. Like this is liberty. This is freedom. Everything is free, right? This is a time in the 50th year that they call that ollie ollie oxen free.
Pigtail.
Right? They're you know, this is societal's reset button, the year of Jubilee, where they say liberty begins, and liberty through all the land and all its inhabitants. The reset button is supposed to happen. It shall be a jubilee for you. So what do you do in this? What do you do for this liberty? What does liberty look like? Well, you shall return every one of you to your property, and every one of you to your family. That 50th year shall be a jubilee for you, and you shall not sow or reap the aftergrowth of the harvest and unpruned vines, for it is a jubilee, and it shall be holy to you. You shall eat only of the field itself produces. So, the jubilee year is for reunification, or restoration, and for liberty, and it's really meant to be a societal reset button, which I think we have a chance to think about. If we've had to change everything for the sake of this virus, we don't have to come back the same. We just don't. And wondering what kind of jubilee this can be, and what will that might actually look like, and what kind of reunification can we consider, what kind of restoration, what would we like to restore, and what kind of liberty do we want to set? How do we want to set people free in this process?
We're coming up on a jubilee year, right? If it's every 50th, I mean, next year is our 150th, right? So
Yeah, next year is our 150th anniversary. There is a jubilee sense and a jubilee need for that. That is very true. Thanks for reminding us, Audrey. And it is really liberty, to proclaim liberty. And I don't think that is a mistaken word here. I don't think that is mistaken understanding that this is for freedom. We are free to set free, and for the sake of reunification and restoring everything. So any questions about this last few parts?
So I have a question. Do you know if in the Old Testament experience, whether the Israelite people ever really celebrated Jubilee year, or by the time it came to be a Jubilee year, were things so entrenched that to give back the property and free the indentured servants would have been repugnant to the people who had the property and the servants?
So the idea, like, it's on the books, but do we actually practice it?
Did they actually do Jubilee?
Yeah.
In the Old Testament experience, would you even know that? I think later on, somewhere in Scripture, when they go into captivity, God says the land is getting its Jubilee rest because you didn't give it. But I can't be sure. I have to find the Scripture.
Yeah, so next week is gonna be going into the prophets and Sabbath during captivity. So we will get there on that. At this moment, I cannot give you an intellectual answer. I don't know I'll have to spend some time with that.
Don't spend too much time with it.
But I think if I looked ahead enough, I think that is a part of next week, in the sense that while you're in captivity, Sabbath becomes a different ball game.
I never figured out how, in practicality, they would ever function with that kind of a system. But I mean, why would you give a loan in the 49th year to anybody because you knew you were not going to get it back because next year's number 50? Or why would you buy any slaves in the last 5 years because they're all going to go away in the 50th year? Just the natural human tendencies of business would seem to undermine the concept of the Jubilee year.
But yeah, but Dave, think of year 51 and the commerce that it would produce.
Oh, I'm sorry I asked the question.
No, I've always had that thought about Jubilee year. Anytime it comes up, I'm going, all right, if anybody was keeping track, and I assume they were, that you'd know, okay, 3 years from now or next year or whenever is Jubilee year, so I'm losing whatever I have coming to me. So why would I go out of my way to promote anything in the last few years before we get to Jubilee?
I think one of the things to recognize here is a Jubilee year is generational, right? So people didn't live to 100 generally. Right. People didn't live past 50. So one of the issues with generational issues is how much should be passed on to the next generation.
Yeah.
So if dad has the debt, or mom has all the debt or whatever, and dad and mom die or getting old, what should be passed on to the next generation, and how should that be handled? Right. Our whole economy right now is more or less built on trying to squeeze every ounce out of our people who are in retirement, so that there's nothing left at the end. Right. So but yet, so the question, I think the societal question, the social question here is how much should be passed down, because 50 years was a bit closer to what life looked like for people living. And so I think, as we talked about the generational side, that this Sabbath was supposed to be passed on from generation to generation. I think there's a generational thing going on with the Jubilee year as well.
Mm-hmm.
That reap and the harvest thing goes right back to the manna in the desert. Because if you harvest and you reap, you take everything and save part of it. But if you only take what you eat, it's what God provides for you right then. It's like the second day it's going to rot. God will provide for you to eat. You don't have to hoard it. So those two tie right back into the very beginning.
Yeah, and I think there's a few documentaries, I don't know, maybe 5, 7, 10 years ago that went after the kind of agricultural issues around corn. I think one was called King Corn or something like that. One of the ones I really appreciated was 2 city guys went and just bought an acre of corn and went through the whole season with the farmer, like, what am I supposed to do here? and tried to make high fructose corn syrup in his kitchen, like, so you add this chemical to that, and how do because so much of corn turns into high fructose corn syrup in America. Mm-hmm. So and it was really interesting at the end of the documentary, the farmer's like, I have to sell. I'm out of this. I'm old. I don't, my next generations aren't taking this. And your acre is literally in the middle of my acre. So what do you? Your acreage is in the middle of my acreage, and I don't have a family to sell this to. I mean, this is going to go to a conglomerate. Mm-hmm. And so the last scene in this documentary, there are these 2 city guys in the middle of this full cornfield on their grass. They just let it grow in grass. And so they're laying on this 1 acre in the middle of this huge cornfield that has now been sold to this huge conglomerate, because they never sold their acre to the conglomerate. So they're just sitting there and like playing catch on their acre in the middle of this cornfield. It's fun. Mm-hmm. But I think it's called King Corn or something like that. It's really interesting. But I think this Jubilee stuff is interesting. And what kind of cues can we take from it now? What kind of exercise can we take now as congregations, especially coming up into our time together as 150 years old?
I am interested in the method by which the writer or, you know, the rule is given down as like guilting people into obeying the Sabbath, not really giving them a whole lot of the positive perspective, but more so like, if you don't, here's what's going to happen. And I just think the methodology is, you know, and then at the end, you're supposed to just forgive everything, you know, after 50 years, like, it's just interesting, especially the one text. It was like, if you don't, like, I'm going to, you know, something in the midst of other people, like I'm going to harm you in the midst of other people. And,
I'm not just gonna kill you. I'm gonna shame you. You are gonna be an example for the rest of everybody else.
yeah.
Right?
And then 50 years later.
I love to think that this is one of the ways that they at that time chose to defend the poor and the needy,
Mhm.
and that this was really a conviction on those who owned their land and businesses, that you better shape up. You better make sure that you treat your employees with Sabbath principles.
Yeah, it's the part that speaks to me was all the rules that came with it. That it sounds like it started out as, okay, this is just a guide for how you're supposed to live as stewards of the land, as people of God, and you ought to just do this. And if we were all fully with the program, that's the way we should all, is the idea of how we're supposed to live. And then, well, okay, we didn't really do that so well, so we need a rule about that. And it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. And now when you introduce the whole concept of penalties, if you don't, then what? Well, okay, I'm calling your bluff. The penalty is I'm going to kill you, but I'm not sure I want to kill you. And so you get all this, it's just gets so messy and such a mess that it's, when it started out as this is just kind of the utopian guide for how we ought to be living. So,
which is a good reminder that when we make it about our relationship with other people, or the rules we're supposed to follow for other people, or the penalties from other people, that we get all mixed up. But when we're focused on Sabbath being about our relationship with God, somehow it all makes sense again.
yeah.
And that's kind of where the occupied, when Israelite becomes occupied, you'll see that, wait a minute, we're going to have to get back to the basics on this.
Mhm.
All right, let me finish up. I have one last slide here for a conclusion, and we'll see if there's any more conversation to be had. All right, so in conclusion, Sabbath expands significantly underneath the law of Moses. There is just no doubt that it was something very simple about creating a relationship between God and humanity, and an instrument of understanding our trust or lack thereof in God. But it significantly expands into societal norms. And so Sabbath becomes less of a gift and more of a regulation. It's kind of like, you know, your kid going to, do I have to go to church? Yes, you have to go to church. You know, like it becomes this regulatory purpose. Sabbath is meant to be a celebration. It is connected to worship in this time of Moses. It's connected to the idea of these convocations of worship. It marks your days. And so Sabbath is meant to protect the earth and the marginalized from being overworked. Sabbath is about not working your occupations. One of the things that changes is it goes from working in general, that everybody should stay home, but to working your occupation, though. So they change the idea that, you know, you now have a job, but there's other things that you might still work at. But now you're not supposed to work your occupations. And this messes with Jesus, because if Jesus is a doctor and he's healing people, then he's breaking Sabbath. But if he's the savior of the world, if that's his occupation, then he's just doing the job that God, then he's just doing what God asks him to do. Right? So when we get to Jesus, I think this makes a big difference. And so Sabbath then signifies a time to reorder your life. This is talking about the Jubilee and the periods in which you are supposed to do these reset buttons for the sake of Jubilee. Or Sabbath is supposed to kind of reorder your life. Any last wonderful thoughts from our group?
No. Happy Mother's Day. I do want
Happy
to
Mother's
say
Day,
to all
everyone.
the ladies, Happy Mother's Day.
I hope you find some Sabbath today, mothers.
For sure.
And if I don't, what will happen?
A portion of you will die inside.
Probably will.
Portion of your husband.
Yeah. All right, let's end in prayer. Dear God, I give thanks for the Sabbath, even in its complexities. It reminds us to spend and be in time with you. I give thanks for this community that has gathered today on this screen from our different homes to have this fruitful yet complex conversation on the Sabbath. Give us rest and a time away in which is rejuvenates us. In your name we pray. Amen.
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 Check the Facebook. I put an article from Walter Brueggemann on Facebook about Psalm 31 and the differences in time that compared to production and efficiency compared to the time in the Bible, which was more about being and becoming. It's a very short article, but very kind of powerful from Walter. Go ahead and look on the Facebook there and take a look as kind of step 2 to today's conversation.
Okay.
Okay.
Very
Take
good.
care, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Have a great day.